All right. If our IT folks are all set and ready to go, we're going to go ahead and get started. All right. It is 3 o'clock, and I'm going to go ahead and call our special meeting to order. Today is Wednesday, May 3rd, 2023, and our special meeting is regarding our main budget workshop. So I will ask our clerk, Stephanie Rosine, welcome back, to please call roll.
Councilmember Dynas.
Here.
Councilmember Estrada.
Here.
Councilmember Sobek.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Carwin.
Here.
And Mayor Zimmerman.
And I'm here, and if we could all please stand for the flag salute. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. We're going to go ahead and get started with our workshop. And Mr. City Manager, who's going to be presenting today?
Yes, Mayor and Council members, I think while we wait for Margarita to show up, we wanted to make sure that we tell you that the workshop is for input only and is intended to just present the framework of the budget. Obviously, the budget is a long process, and one of the things that we focused on while drafting and designing the budget was we looked at the strategic plan, some of the directives that you wanted us to do. We also looked at some of the operational challenges that we've been having throughout the year in capital projects and street maintenance and some of the challenges. So we added some resources there, and also we wanted to make sure that we stay conservative. As you recall, we presented a 10-year forecast model a couple months ago, and we want to make sure that we move cautiously and we're prudent with how we spend our money. We expect that the next 2 years are going to be a little bit difficult because of the uncertainty in the economy, so we want to make sure that we budget prudently and cautiously. So the budget, like I said, is a budget workshop. We are presenting the framework of the budget. You're going to get a lot more detail in about a month when we bring the formal budget for adoption. The workshop also includes some of the CIP elements of the two workshops you've had before. So I think Margarita is making her way in, and I'll shut up now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Armando, and welcome, Ms. Cornejo.
Hi, good afternoon. My apologies for the delay. Just trying to get you guys printed copies. They'll be here momentarily, and then we have some little handouts for you guys at the end as well. My name is Margarita Cornejo. I am the Deputy Finance Director, and I am pleased this afternoon to be able to provide the budget workshop related to the fiscal year 23-24 and 24-25 for the upcoming budget cycle. As we kind of outlined at the first CIP workshop earlier in April, the intent of the city is to move forward with a 2-year budget cycle, commencing with this one. And really that has several advantages, which we will cover. Then the intent of the workshop today is really to collect input and feedback from the public and the council as we prepare to bring a final budget for consideration at the upcoming June 7th council meeting. So today, we will outline kind of the initial proposal when it comes really in relation to general fund and quality of life expenditures and revenues, as well as some of our other special revenues and expenditures. Before we jump into the PowerPoint and kind of in alignment with where we're going. When we started this journey for the 2-year budget cycle and kind of the handouts that we have this year, we talked about how kind of the analogy that we used was climbing a mountain and hiking and getting that kind of visibility. And in this year's kind of hike that we went through, we actually decided to go through 2 peaks because we wanted to go through the 2-year budget cycle. So as we embarked on this journey and got to that kind of higher elevation, there were challenges in just kind of structuring and figure out how you put together a 2-year budget cycle. But We are happy today to present you a balanced budget for the next 2 years. And before we get into the numbers, our starting place is always to remind ourselves kind of where this community wants to be. And that's all kind of aligned and phrased out in our strategic plan. This year was unique too, in not only embarking on that 2-year process, but also the city went through a new strategic plan adoption that the community and council kind of had several workshops for, and really put some time to think of what does our community look like for the next 5 years as we continue to strive to work to building a safe and thriving and premier place to be. In that, there were 5 kind of pillar goals that have been adopted as part of the strategic plan, and that's community engagement and social infrastructure, connectivity and mobility, safe and vibrant community, unique identity, and thriving economy. And so the strategic plan continues to serve as kind of the guiding document that the city follows when building its budget, whether it's a first 12-month or a 2-year. And that's kind of our starting base point, that when departments were working through their budget development proposals, kept in mind to make sure that the services and the goals and the objectives that they move towards all directly connect to our 5-year strategic plan. So, a municipal budget, is a plan of expected revenues and expenditures for the upcoming fiscal year, which is defined as a 12-month period. Different than a calendar year, our fiscal year starts on July 1st and ends on June 30th. The revenue side for a local municipality like us constitutes things like property tax, our sales tax, our voter passed quality of life measure, and then various special revenue funds. On our expenditure side, we put them in kind of some main buckets, and that's our personnel, our workforce, our contract services, capital outlays, and infrastructure and programs. One underlying kind of philosophy that we work on when the budget is put together is that at the end of the exercise, we propose and end up with an adopted budget that is structurally balanced, meaning that our recurring revenues are always equal to our recurring expenditures in that adopted budget. And that is what is being proposed for the 2 years tonight. So looking at 2024 and 2025, there are some main components that we will summarize on going through today. Starting off with the budget process overview. What did it look like? What went into it? What was the timeline? What will the timeline continue to be like now that we look at it in a 24-month horizon instead of 12 months? How did we engage the public? And then what do we move forward for adoption? In preparation for that, some of the key things that we look at are the economic forecast and revenue analysis. What do things tell us at a national, regional, state level, and then more localized to us? What are our revenues trending like, and how may they be impacted by things that are existing and happening within our boundaries and outside of that? On our operating budget side, we look at our operating and maintenance expenditures related to personnel and staffing needs, capital outlays, which are larger purchases of $5,000 or more, and then general fund and quality of life, Measure DD, and other funds. In conjunction with that, we have the development of our CIP, or Capital Improvement Plan, which already stands as a 5-year plan, but in this year's proposal, there are 2 separate years that are being proposed with identified funding. So to give some narrative and idea of what goes into budget planning and management. On the planning side, which is our starting point, we really started this process early in the winter, in January, for this new budget cycle. And things that go into it, well, it's a lot of components. Really starting and looking at our revenue analysis and projections and our baseline expenditures. There are certain commitments that the city has in place that we know that inherently have to be paid. Things such as leases that we have in place for things like our city hall and other sites. We also have an existing workforce that is already in place that needs to be factored in. And then we have certain baseline revenues that we look at from year to year, like our sales tax and our property tax, to make sure that we understand how they're trending and make reasonable projections on what we can expect to receive. This all aligns with the second point of having good long-range financial planning and understanding what the impacts of financial decisions are going to be, not just for the limited kind of 12-month period or even 24-month, but beyond that, and how that kind of impacts other decisions that may come down the pipeline. So from the budgeting end, one area that there's a lot of considerable time and effort spent on is the workforce development. And that is looking at each of the positions that exist within the organization and making sure that they are appropriately budgeted out for the proposed budget cycle. So for this iteration, it was for both fiscal year 23-24 and 24-25. We currently have a workforce that's represented by 6 different association groups. So part of the budget task is to analyze and make sure that there's a full understanding of what the financial impacts and benefits outlined in each one of those are, building that position not only in the salary and wages, but all the compensation and benefits that might be aligned with that, and making sure that that's factored into the budget. Along with the numbers that are input and the costs associated with providing services, whether that be through personnel, contracts, or the purchase of goods and services, is also the narrative side, which is just as important as articulating the numbers, and that's defining specific goals and objectives and key performance indicators as a department puts together its vision or its financial proposal for the next 12 months, and in this case, 24 months. Goals and objectives are directly aligned and connected to the strategic plan, to one or more of the goals that are identified there, and so are key performance indicators. The distinction between the goal and objectives are those larger identified goals that are oftentimes included in the strategic plan. For example, exploring things like an incubator feasibility study. Key performance indicators are equally important because those speak to the quality of service that's being delivered by a department. And as we've moved in this iteration of the budget, we looked to having our departments identify not only kind of what and volume and what quantity of services they deliver, but how they strive to provide high quality, establishing things like standard turnaround periods for whether that be plan check reviews or processing things like purchase orders, are something that the city looks at seriously internally to make sure that not only in meeting those kind of big, larger goals and objectives, but also in the day-to-day delivery of our services, our residents can be assured that as an organization, the city looks to provide top quality service. An additional component in the planning element relates to our internal service funds, and that's our information technology department, fleet, and facilities. Those provide services across the organization to different departments in different capacities and ways. So their budget basically looks at anything and everything that every department may need, and then it is consolidated and grouped together and managed by the professional staff that oversees each of the departments. Once those requests and the overhead and the costs associated with the staff of those respective departments like IT, fleet, and facilities are put together, then from the budget side, there is some coordination and analysis that has to be done on allocating that back to the respective departments and making sure that that's all factored into providing a balanced budget. And from the 2 workshops that you guys and the public have already seen, there is also the capital improvement program development process that really lays out the infrastructure projects that will be coming in the horizon. Following that, there is a lot of internal department budget review and analysis that is formally structured around city executive, department, and finance meetings, where the proposed budget for each department, whether it be personnel, operations, or capital outlays, are discussed, analyzed, follow-up questions are had. Oftentimes, follow-up research is done to make sure that there's a good understanding of what's being requested and that it makes sense, again, with the city's finances and also with the strategic plan of where we're trying to go. Towards the end, but as well as important is the community engagement and workshops of the planning phase. It's important that when a budget is being developed, that there are some opportunities for the public to provide input on what is being proposed to provide for the community. And so we factor in dedicated workshops. There are 2 for CIP, and then there's the one that we are having today, deliberately to collect input, so that before a budget is formalized, there is an opportunity for anybody who may want to provide input to do so. And in conjunction with the general fund and quality of life budget, there are a number of other special revenues and expenditure budgets that are developed at the same time that provide crucial funding to the city. That's in the form of things like our gas tax that provides a lot of funding for our public works operations, but we also have a number of special districts like CFDs, CSAs, LLMDs that provide dedicated funding for specific services throughout our community. Once we finalize the budget development for this cycle, that is just kind of our starting point to the budget on what it looks like. There's the management side that will continue throughout the next 2 fiscal years. And that involves monitoring of actuals, ensuring that revenues and expenditures are trending in the way that they are projected, and if there are any adjustments that need to be made, that those are recognized and adjusted sooner rather than later. There is also the budget carryover that happens regularly, and that is in relation to purchase orders, CIP budget, and grants that have previous approvals in prior fiscal years, but still have activity that needs to be finalized and carries over into the new year. So that's where you oftentimes will see your adopted budget and then an adjusted budget that has an increase on that. So that is part of the regular management of the budget process. There are also additional budget appropriation requests that come for council consideration throughout the year for additional appropriations in things like perhaps their CIP projects that need additional funding. That is part of the budget management process that requires that prior to them being presented for consideration, there's a vetting to ensure that the funds are in place to be able to provide that additional appropriation. And on the performance side, there is a tracking to make sure that goals and objectives and key performance indicators, or KPIs, are being completed timely and that there's progress towards this. We introduced at the first CIP workshop the 10-year forecast model that the city embarked on over the last 12 months on setting in place. And part of the management will be to ensure that that model is actively used throughout the year when it comes to considering any important, significant financial decisions, and that is aligned with all long-range financial planning efforts. And we just met about a month ago, and that was for the mid-year review of the current year's budget cycle. That will continue to be even with a 2-year, and there will also be a mid-cycle review. Which takes me to the next slide, which is what does a 2-year budget cycle look like in areas of kind of key components. Still start the fiscal year on a July 1st date, but we start earlier when we start on the first year of the 2. We would start in the fall by looking at internal review of baseline revenues and expenditure estimates. In December, really focusing a lot on long-term financial projections, so that when we meet in January and start the department kickoffs for discussion on personnel requests and things like internal service fund requests, we have a really strong understanding of what the revenue and expenditure look like from a baseline standpoint. In March, departments in the City Executive Office and Finance Department would still meet to review budget considerations. In April and May of the first year, we would hold, like we have this year, the CIP workshops, the quality of life meetings, and the budget workshop that we're holding today. In preparation for the second year, in that April, is where we would look at the mid-cycle review and see if there were any significant adjustments that should be captured and adopted before starting that subsequent July 1st. What is important to stress about the 2-year budget process is that the advantages of it are that it provides more long-term financial planning. So it pushes a decision when it comes to personnel to be thought of not just what is the cost for the next 12 months, but beyond that. It also streamlines and consolidates the budget processes. As we just went in the previous slide, there's a number of things that have to be put together and compiled, and we appreciate all the efforts of the departments and the staff in doing that. It is a several-month process, and by doing a 2-year process, while, especially this time around, it's new, there is a little bit more kind of effort into going to it. It is well worth it, because when you look at it again in April, you're looking more at the adjustment side, but you have a really strong understanding of what your next year should look like. Now, on the other hand, we also want to reiterate and express that the 2-year budget cycle does not eliminate things like how frequently we report to the public or to council. It is not our intent to replace that, and really it's to take advantage of the first 2 points, the long-term financial planning and the streamline that we look to this. We would still continue regular public meetings, including mid-year reviews and mid-cycle reviews as part of the budget process. It is the ultimate goal of the organization to move to more regular reporting even than mid-cycle, and move potentially to things like quarterly reporting as we transition to our new ERP system that would have more capabilities like that. Year-end reporting and accounting and financial transparency would continue in the same schedules that we do, and would continue to be something we embed and identify as high priority in all operations that we do. The 2 budget that are being proposed separately, so expenditures would still be authorized to the respective 12 months, because revenues would be expected to be coming in that trajectory. So it's not like there'd be a free-for-all of all money all at once, and then looking in the next 2 years, we wouldn't have enough room for that. They're still managed at separate fiscal years. Our community workshops and budget timelines, as it stands today, started with 2 CIP workshops. One was held on April 5th. The second was held on April 19th. We convened the Quality of Life Measure DED Committee on April 25th. And today we are presenting the initial budget for council's input and feedback on what is being suggested for the next 2 fiscal years, in anticipation that we will return on June 7th with a finalized budget for consideration of adoption. This slide gives you the total numbers of what the operating budget looks like. On the expenditure side, for 23-24, the total budget appropriation request is $97,035,222, and in 24-25, it's $94.6 million. At the top of this table is the revenue side of revenues that are anticipated to be received. And so in 23-24, that would be $91.7 million. And in 24-25, that's $94.6 million. You will see towards the bottom of the first table that there is the use of fund balance in 23-24. That is intentional, and that is the use of fund balance for CIP projects. Specifically, the majority of that funding is coming from Quality of Life, which has a projected balance of about $4.01 million. And there are a number of high priority CIP projects that have been identified in the next budget cycle that have also been recommended by the Quality of Life Committee to move forward with using that fund balance for. On the right side is the operating budget, which outlines personnel, operating, one-time studies, capital outlays, transfers and allocations, so everything but CIP. And in there is where you see on the revenue side, the $91.7 million for 23-24, and then $94.6 million for 24-25. On the expenditure side, the expenditures are $90.7 million and $94.22 million in the 2 years respectively, showing that the revenues actually exceed expenditures by a little bit in both years, and that that excess is actually being redirected towards the CIP program. So what's being presented for an operating budget for council input and consideration is to adopt a balanced budget on the operational side and use fund balance specifically for some high priority CIP projects. On the budget component side, it touched a little bit on it. There's the operating budget, which funds the city's daily business programs and services. That's personnel, programs, capital outlays, and equipment. And then there's the CIP side, which provides a financial plan for the long-term capital improvements and facilities. And before we go into the expenditure side, we'll provide just a general kind of outlook on the basis of the revenues that have been projected for the next 2 years. At a national level, similar to what was expressed at mid-year, there's still that kind of element of uncertainty. There are good things, and then there are things that make people a little bit more nervous. What's been lagging for the last 2 years is that word inflation, right? Inflation hit historic highs last summer, and the fear was that it was just like unstoppable. And so at the federal level, there was a deliberate intent to try to rein that in by increasing interest rates, understanding that that in itself would slow things down. But at the same time, trying to balance that with not slowing them too much where we would end up in a recession. The lingering inflation is still there, albeit not at the levels that it was last summer. Also not at the levels that at the Federal Reserve they would like to see. And so even as of today, interest rates have been increased, and there's still some appetite to see that if it doesn't level out more, that they would still do that while balancing it to make sure that we don't move into a recession altogether at a national level. This in turn has led to the overall kind of consumer confidence and estimate and housing activity to slow down. As it becomes more expensive to borrow money, it naturally moves things to slow down. As people keep hearing headlines of things slowing down, it kind of makes people sometimes a little bit more nervous about what the future may look like. And in the last several months, there's been several headlines about certain banks, defaulting, and that also creates a little bit of uncertainty and instability out there. But the positive side that continues to go throughout the last year, even in spite of inflation and even in spite of the high interest rate, is that unemployment is at a historic low. Nationally, regionally, and at a state level, and it continues to do so. Labor reports continue to show that the labor market is tight and competition for workforce is more competitive than ever. And while housing prices have not increased the way that they were maybe a year ago, they continue to appreciate in value. At the state and regional level, when we met about a month ago, we talked about how the state of California had gone from a year ago stating they had a budget surplus to now a multi-billion-dollar deficit. And that is a large number, but the state of California has a really large budget. And the really driving force for their deficit in this year was, again, in the overall economy, because a lot of the revenues are impacted by income itself, and as investments went down, that impacted them. Albeit in all, the state of California has plenty of reserves to be able to cover that, but it did show you a stark contrast at a state level, how you can go from one year to another, and that just kind of expresses some of the activity that you've been seeing at a more national level. Regionally, there's a strong labor market and business activity. Regional unemployment is at 4.1%. Transportation and warehousing specific to the Inland Empire continue to be a driving force to the region's recovery and beyond that. And business and industry increased activity by 13%, as well as restaurants and hotels by 9%. I know when we looked at it about a year ago in the last budget cycle, the numbers were more in the double digits, but that, to provide some context, was a lot related to, and particularly industries like hotels were very impacted by COVID, so you did see a larger increase percentage in the prior year. What we're seeing now is probably a more steady growth. Which leads to the last point. We continue to have steady and continued growth in residential and development activity, and that's across the region down to the local level. When we met about a month ago, in our major revenues, there was a recommendation to adjust our development revenues down conservatively, seeing that in the first half of the fiscal year for 22-23, we had seen some slowed activity. But as we have continued to monitor the activity for the last 2 months, March and April have performed really well for our development departments, and that includes building and safety, engineering and planning. So we look optimistically, albeit cautiously, that we saw our lowest point for our fiscal year, and that we will end the second half of fiscal year 22-23 in higher kind of activity than we saw earlier in the year. That said, too, there is a number of industrial projects that are going through the CEQA environmental review process and are anticipated to move into the entitlement during the next 2-year budget cycle. As we prepared the projections related to our more localized revenue for the next 2 years, we did have discussions with our development departments and looked at an area where we looked at it realistically and said at the same time conservatively, if we do in fact experience some element of slowdown, what realistically within our time, within our growth, can we say we still see some growth. Menifee is a fast-growing city, independent even of any national recessionary activity. So for us, the slowdown just means our growth is slower than it would be in a number of years. So as we looked into 23-24 and 24-25, our projections still show some growth in those revenues, albeit at a slower pace. In relation to the long-term financial planning policies and practices that the city implements in our financial management is, as of September 2021, we continue to maintain our reserve fund policy at 35%. As we developed the proposed budgets for 23-24 and 24-25, the analysis was done to ensure that we would have the capacity to bring up the reserves to the requirements based on the proposed budgets, and we can verify that that would be the case. We have the fund balance to be able to do so. We proactively continue to pay our unfunded pension liability and include it as part of our annual budget process, and it would be a recommendation to continue to do so from year to year. And then in the development of our 5-year CIP program, continue to look for ways to leverage funding opportunities, not just in the general fund and quality of life or our special revenue funds, but looking beyond. In particular, our engineering department and our community services department, as you know, have been very successful in the last few months in securing some crucial funding to help move along some CIP projects and offset the cost of putting in infrastructure in our community. On the right side is the fund policy summarized breakdown. Our 35% reserve requirement, which is one of the higher ones regionally within our area, is broken down into 3 categories. There's the operating stabilization reserve, which is a 12.5% requirement. There is the economic uncertainty reserve, which is also a 12.5 for economic distress. And then there's the unassigned fund balance reserve requirement, which is 10%. And together they add up to the 35%. Represented in that chart is what these would look like with the proposed budgets that are being presented for your input and consideration. You can see there's a slight increase from 24-25 across all of them. To address and summarize our principal revenues for the city of Menifee, it is our sales tax, our quality of life measure, property tax, vehicle in lieu tax, VLF revenue, our development revenue from building, planning, and engineering revenue, franchise fees, and one-time revenues. So our principal revenues, we are confident to recommend increases in the next 2 years, albeit not at the same pace that we've seen in prior ones. But in particular, when it comes to sales tax and quality of life and property tax, we regularly meet with our consultant HDL to get actuals and kind of trends on how they're going. We've looked at the projections that they've given us for the next 5 years, as well as made professional assessments on kind of what our historicals have performed, and are providing recommendations for adjustments in both sales tax and quality of life based on that analysis. Building, planning, and engineering revenue we talked about, and in particular with the first year, it does say 14.48% from the year adjusted, but as mentioned earlier, we did adjust it down at mid-year, and that's why you see a larger percentage. The amount that's being proposed is in line with kind of the trend of what we're seeing right now. In relation to our franchise fees, the largest one being the franchise fees that come from waste management, we continue to see steady growth year over year as more accounts are added in. We have also seen increase in our franchise fees coming in from our electric utility. The one franchise fees that does decrease, but in total, it's still in, across all franchise fees, we are proposing a recommendation, and that is cable. And that's because as people start to cut the cable and not use TV as service as much, we have seen that one steadily decrease over time. And then the last one is our one-time revenues. And for 24-25, we don't have any recommendations of use of one-time revenue at this point, but for 23-24, we do. And that is the use of American Rescue funding in the amount of $531,000 to be used towards CIP 20-13. That's the Paloma Wash pedestrian project, as well as using $600,000 from the Commerce Point Developer Agreement towards the EDC SG specific plan. In graphical representation, here is the 5-year historicals and the proposed revenues for these principal revenues for the next 2 fiscal years. As you can see, there's steady growth across all of them, but as we look at all of them, they have experienced steady growth in their last 5-year history. Going on to now the expenditure side of the operating budget, we have personnel costs, we have operating and maintenance expenses, and capital outlays. So the personnel costs and requests are reviewed with each new request as part of the budget review development process. Each department is required to provide a justification, identify if there's any funding that can be used beyond like our general fund to fund that position, if it offsets any other expenses, if there's a space accommodations that need to be done for that. And then what is presented for your guys' consideration and input today is based on all the requests that come in and those that are identified critical need and meet stress points in areas that have been identified in the last several months as needing to get kind of some additional staffing support. For 23-24, the breakdown of personnel costs is about $40.9 million. For 24-25, it's $42.7 million. In the operating and maintenance expenses, this includes the operating expenses of things like contract services and just general supplies, everything non-personnel and non-capital outlay. Capital outlays are any purchases that are one-time, larger than $5,000, and have a useful life of 5 years or more. And there are some capital outlay requests that are included in both years. But we'll go ahead and start with personnel. On the personnel side, as the current year, where we stand after mid-year is, there are 320.4 positions. That's 294 full-time and 26.4 part-time. What's being proposed tonight is the addition of 7 FTEs, full-time positions. In addition, there is the request for the Menifee PD cadets program that is part-time staff. It's 4 part-time positions, which translates to 2 FTEs for a total of 9 positions when you count the part-time cadets. And then request for 7 reclassifications across various departments. In 24-25, there are no personnel requests recommended at this time. It is a recommendation to reevaluate these and assess these at the mid-cycle as we start to get a picture of what the revenue outlay looks like and do an analysis for that, understanding that departments have various needs and other staffing requests were submitted for consideration. Here is a summary of the personnel requests, starting with the new personnel requests at the top. Starting with the engineering department, there is a request in the capital project CIP division for a project manager. This position would be funded by the general fund, and this addresses support needed for the CIP program. We have a very robust CIP program with a number of active projects already in place and more to add in the next 2 years. So to continue to move that along and get the support necessary to do that, a project manager is being requested for consideration. There is also a request for a senior public works inspector under the construction inspection division of engineering. Now, this position would support both land development operations as well as CIP. So it has the dual ability to also address the CIP program needs, but also land development. And while the salary and benefits are listed there, there is an offsetting cost that has been decreased. A consultant services would be eliminated in the amount of about $120,000 for the first year and $140,000 for the second year. In the information technology department, there is a request for a cybersecurity manager, and this speaks to the importance and significance as local agencies continue to see themselves sometimes exposed to, dangerous cyber incidents that are out there. This would strengthen the city's ability to ensure that our systems and processes are not compromised and are actively being managed and looked at by a dedicated manager focused on that. We have the addition of the cadets. That again is 4 cadets working part-time for the police department. And then the last 4 positions are related to maintenance support, and that's in our public works area. That's the addition of a heavy equipment operator as well as a street maintenance worker. And then in the community services side, there's a request for a senior parks landscape maintenance worker and a park landscape maintenance worker 2. Now, the landscape park maintenance worker 2 is requested to be starting in the second half of the year, so the salary that's reflected there is for half a year. It's also important to note that the last 4 positions are not general fund funded. They would be paid by gas tax, which provides funding dedicated for road maintenance support, and then special districts, which are our various CFDs, LLMDs, and CSAs. On the reclassification request, there's a request for 7 total. Now, the net impact of the reclassifications is actually a negative just under $2,400, and that is because there is a reclassification to bring down the senior fire permit technician to a fire permit technician. The other positions relate to requests from the Building and Safety Department, the Community Development Department, HR and Risk Management, Finance, Fire Marshal, Human Resources, and then non-City of Menifee personnel related, but as part of the contract that's included in the upcoming year is the addition of a 0.6 FTE administrative assistant to be shared with the City of Lake Elsinore to provide the administrative support that the fire department needs. So I can pause here if there's specific questions you guys want to have on the personnel. So if departments are available to provide response in there, or I can continue, we can hold till the end.
Thank you, Margarita. With regard to these personnel requests, who vetted the necessity for these positions, or is that part of what we're doing here?
So it's a combination effort. So initially, they're all submitted and discussed during the internal review between the executive office, finance, to ensure that there's the financing capacity for it, and then the department itself. And then council is also vetting and analyzing. The list was larger. Obviously, the department, we couldn't accommodate all the positions that are being requested. So it's a combined kind of effort. These are the recommendations based on kind of what's been identified as critical needs recently. And so it is for council's consideration today to decide if to proceed with these.
So if in each of these requests, is the director of the particular department the person who is saying, I've looked at this, I've weeded out the necessary and unnecessary, and these are the things I think are necessary?
Yes, they are submitting a justification form with the personnel request that explains the position request itself, if there's any capital cost, any spacing needs that need to be accommodating, and what the need is. Now, usually all the departments are working in conjunction with their analyst support, and then the department head is the one that's validating that to move forward that request along the process for consideration.
Thank you.
And Councilmember Sobek?
Thank you. Margarita, thank you for your report so far. I'd just like to know, for the police department, they would like a four part-time positions. Is that for cadets to work at the police department? I mean, I didn't know exactly what that is for.
I know while Captain Gutierrez is walking up, I can start to explain. That is a program, and it's a development program. They begin if they do have an interest in law enforcement, that can start the basic training within the office and the field, light field, and I can let him continue more
Yeah, I
to
was
develop
wondering
them.
what they would do.
Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council members. Yes, the cadet program is somewhat of an apprentice program, usually between 18 and 21 years of age, part-time, for those people that are, those youth that are interested in law enforcement. They are utilized throughout the department. A lot of times they can do data entry, work in records, they can work in CSI property evidence, in our investigations bureau. They can do ride-alongs, and they can also go out and do light traffic control in the presence of another police officer. So they're very, very helpful, and it's a great program for us to connect with the youth and develop them into the career law enforcement.
So is this taken from your pool of cadets that you already have?
So those are explorers.
Oh,
This
those
is
are
a completely
explorers, okay.
separate program.
So it is separate, okay.
Yeah.
Would-
The Explorer program's volunteer.
Would it be like college students who are already in that, taking classes in that field?
They could be taking criminal justice classes, and to clarify for the explorers, if we do have any explorers that want to enter the cadet program, certainly we would want them to do that as well, because that would be the progression for their career path.
Okay, all right, thank you. That was, just had a few questions on that. And then my second question was for community services. Just wondering why we're wanting to increase the maintenance workers in the community service department.
Absolutely. You know, we just opened the new Remington Park a couple months ago, and actually, I think the whole council was at that grand opening. They're also anticipating that Underwood Park would be completed very soon. Bryce Howe actually just did a walk of that park this morning. We're anticipating having a grand opening for that in the next couple weeks. Then we also have Banner Park, which is anticipated to be open during the summer. That one also has a splash pad, just to let the community know. And then also Quartz Ranch, which is being developed by Lennar, is underway and will probably be done sometime in the summertime as well. So we have various parks that are being opened. Also, in addition to that, as we build more streets throughout the city to complement what Mr. Fiddler is proposing, there's that street landscape that needs to be maintained. And as Ms. Cornejo pointed out, we do have funding from our maintenance CFDs to fund these positions.
Okay, all right, thank you. Those are my questions.
If I can get the PowerPoint back up, please. Thank you. Okay, so on the capital outlays and operation and maintenance costs, what our big asks are for in the capital outlays for the next 2 years really relate to fleet replacement. When the city formed its police department in 2020, we had no choice but to do the big time investment and bite the bullet to set up all the capital infrastructure that we were going to need. That included the purchase of the vehicles. As a geographically large city, the patrols have to navigate along quite large distances, and the vehicles themselves go through a lot of wear and tear, and eventually will need to go through a replacement cycle. That, combined with the challenges in the supply chain of getting vehicles on time, has really moved to the forefront the importance of moving along the replacement of these vehicles sooner rather than later, so the organization does not find itself having to replace 30 patrol vehicles all at once, because that's a much larger expense. So what's being proposed is that in the 23-24 and 24-25, the replacement of 8 patrol vehicles vehicles per year are replaced, so we can get in the mechanism of replacing those and recycling those out in a more financially easier way to do that. Also allowing for sufficient time, as the order time takes several months to get that. So there is a request to include that in there. For the upcoming year, there's also the purchase of one new vehicle for the senior construction inspector, which is a new personnel request. And those are the larger capital outlay requests that are being proposed for the next 2 years. And on the operating and maintenance side, we have a lot of existing kind of baseline expenditures that we have to fulfill and pay, and that really relates to our insurance premiums. We have experienced increased insurance premiums over the last few years, year over year, across all categories. That's general liability, workers' compensation, and cybersecurity. And so, for instance, we saw an increase of $428,000 from 22-23 in the 23-24 proposed. We've also seen an increase in our fire contract services, about $1.8 million, and that's the direct relation to the fact that there were state labor negotiations that were completed over the last several months, as well as the medic unit that was added is now active and is staffed, so you see the realized cost of that. As mentioned earlier, the city has several association groups. Our personnel is represented by them, and there were negotiations that were done and benefits that are committed. And so what we see here are the reflection of personnel that has been added, as well as the negotiations and benefits that have been captured in those MOUs. For 24-25, kind of have a similar summary there, but we continue to see increased insurance premiums, as well as there is an anticipated increase in fire contract services for $930,000, and then an anticipated increase in personnel costs and labor costs for about $1.72 million.
Marguerite, if you could, Councilmember Estrada is in the queue.
Hey, Margarita, I have a question about the Menifee PD patrol vehicles. I'll be upfront. A lot of conversations I have with the residents, and I'm sorry, this might not be a question for you. Maybe this is for Mr. Gutierrez. A lot of face-to-face conversations I have is, wow, look at these brand new trucks. And they're excited for our police department, but we started in 2020 and it's 2023, and only 2 years worth of use has been on these brand new vehicles. Now, a lot of residents always bring this up to me, so how much wear and tear exactly has gone on over 2 years?
Councilmember Estrada, I'll try to help answer that question. It's not only about wear and tear, it's about getting into a cycle. So we acquired 40 police vehicles in 2020. So that means in 2024, 2025, we're going to have to acquire 40 vehicles over again, because they will start reaching 80 to 100,000 miles. So in order for us to not have to acquire 40 vehicles all at once, we get into a cycle where we replace 8 per year. So buying them now helps us prolong the life of some vehicles, while also when we're putting these new ones in service so we can rotate them in, also gives us some flexibility for maintenance of existing vehicles. Right now, we do not have any maintenance vehicle or pool cars for staff to use when their cars are out of service. So doing this, building this cycle now and putting in 8 vehicles per year helps us to extend the useful life of some of the vehicles that we have. And because they will reach over the 5-year typical life cycle. To go back to the maintenance portion, the vehicles are heavily used. They do 15, 20,000 miles per year. Our streets, or a lot of them are dirt roads. So we have the Chevy Tahoes, so they do get a lot of wear and tear.
Can you repeat for the public how many miles are on the vehicles right now?
I imagine between, some of them are in the range of 40 to 45,000. It depends. There's some of them are in the mid to high 30s. Some of them are mid to high 40s, depending on what type of usage.
Mr. Gutierrez, Captain Gutierrez, do you feel like the 45,000 miles is hindering your ability to do your job?
No, not currently, but I think over the next couple of years, another 40 to 45,000 miles will be put on those same vehicles, and then it'll become cost prohibitive to continue to maintenance those same vehicles with 90 to 100,000 miles. The only thing I would add also, if this is improved, if these purchases are approved now for this fiscal year and fiscal year, or 23, 24, 24, 25, we could place the order, but we probably won't even see those vehicles for about a year. So the sooner we can get them, the sooner we can get it approved, the sooner we can order it, because they're about a year out or so.
Okay, and I want the police department, I want the public to know, I want you to be as well prepared as possible, okay? I want you to do the best job, reach your potential, but for many middle income, lower income residents, they may hear 40,000 miles on a car, it could probably take a little bit more.
Yeah, no, completely understandable. We believe this is the most fiscally prudent way to go about this. And with these additional vehicles, we start lowering the miles, which will extend their service life. So it's not like, Nick, sorry, had a blank there for a second, mentioned, rather than 4 years, we might be able to keep them with these additional vehicles if we continue this pattern 5, 6 years. And it actually is saving the taxpayers money. And we do take really, really good care of them. Our fleet services does a great job. So this is the most fiscally prudent way to go about this.
So with replacement vehicles, we would still keep the old ones? Or where would they go? Do we get rid of them?
Yeah, eventually they could be, once their useful service life is up, we'd have to take all the equipment off and they can be sold at auction, or there's a couple of other options for that.
Okay, so a vehicle with 45,000 miles would be sold at auction?
No, sir. Today, some of our vehicles have probably between 40 and 55,000 miles on them. We're not getting rid of those vehicles. We're going to continue to drive those until they're about 90 to 100,000 miles. We anticipate that occurring in the next 2 years.
Okay, so around 90 to 100 is when you look to auction them off?
Yes, because with these types of vehicles and the terrain that we have to traverse on a daily basis, most of these vehicles now are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so there's a lot of miles with the 50 square miles that the officers are traversing on a daily basis. The maintenance becomes cost prohibitive on some of these vehicles once it reaches that level of mileage.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And I also have, Councilmember Sobek was in the queue. I don't see it anymore.
You know what? I'll just do a follow-up. Councilmember Estrada kind of asked my question when you talked about putting them out at auction. As you start this rotation, will that help keep it in that budget line to purchase new cars as you do sell them at auction?
Yes, and there are certain vehicles, like we started out with our lieutenants, they have Tahoes. So we're going to transition them into a different type of vehicle. And those vehicles have low mileage on them, so we're going to repurpose those vehicles into sergeant vehicles. So if we can repurpose any of our vehicles, we're absolutely going to do that. That's our first option. But this 8 per year cycle will certainly get us to where we need to be and be able to lower the mileage being put on these vehicles.
I appreciate that proactiveness from our police department, because there's no way we want to purchase 50 and 60 vehicles at one time again. So thank you for that.
Welcome.
Mr. Villa, did you want to share?
Yes, Mayor and Council, I just want to add that there's a little bit of a different standard of care when it comes to police vehicles. And that's because they do take a beating, but also when they get into a high-speed pursuit, they need to be in top shape. And we tend to frown on the idea of having vehicles with 100,000 miles, getting into high pursuits. It becomes a liability for not only the officer, the city, and also the residents. So we need to be able to have the vehicles in top shape. Our intent, and I think we've discussed this, is to be able to find a way to inventory those vehicles and find a recycle or a repurpose for those vehicles so that we can use them in other less intensive departments. So we're going to come back to that. That's why we're only doing 8, And by the time we get to the second year, we should be recycling those vehicles to pool cars that are less intense and not as demanding, right? The high pursuit. Every time a vehicle gets into a high pursuit over 40 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour, it needs to be re-inspected and make sure that it's in top shape, because when you're in high pursuit, you hit bumps and you hit all kinds of things, and again, it becomes a liability for a lot of reasons, right, Captain?
No, that is correct. Yeah, the fleet services checks the brakes, the tires, the suspension, and all of that stuff to make sure everything's still properly functioning after that pursuit. And to just add to the repurposing, in addition to what I've mentioned already, we have other vehicle needs. You see unmarked type vehicles, volunteers that need vehicles to drive, staff to drive vehicles to training. And so even when those things do mileage out for a patrol purpose, there is a possibility of us still having a use for those vehicles.
All right, thank you so much. I think we're ready. If we can put the slide back up, I just want to be clear that that vehicle that's shown is not the vehicle that we're going to purchase.
Yeah. I just wanted it to move.
That's the new design of.
That's the new design.
Okay, so looking at our quality of life measure DD measure and the funding. We convened the Quality of Life Committee on April 25th, 2023 to review the proposed budgets for 23-24 and 24-25, and following their review, the committee did make a motion to recommend the budget as presented related to quality of life for council's consideration. So since its inception, when it was first placed for voters in November 2016, quality of life has just been a monumental funding source to the city's efforts to increase our public safety, enhance our fire services, and improve our infrastructure. Quality of life really is one of the main components of the city being able to have its own police department, also being able to provide some crucial public safety infrastructure like the ladder truck and medic units. So as we go through year to year and we look at that, it's just so meaningful to look at how crucial a funding like this and how much it can do. I mean, it's really been in existence for 5 years, and the amount of impact it has done to the city's principal areas of public safety, fire services, and infrastructure is really astounding. So to the 23-24 budget, the revenues stand at 21.038. That's what's projected to be received in the upcoming 12 months. And then there's the use of fund balance, which we showed in the early summary slides. When we looked at the quality of life budget at mid-year, it already had the fund balance of about 3.8, more or less. And at that point in time, the decision was made to hold off on it because there were some key CIP projects that were coming on the horizon, a couple that had were looking to have grant funding secured but needed a match for it. So in anticipation for that is what is being, why that funding wasn't used at that time, but it is being recommended tonight to be used for several CIP projects. And so you see the combined revenue for 23-24 is the revenue including interest that will come in, as well as the full use of the fund balance for quality of life. And how it will be distributed is for code enforcement, which historically has been used to fund 3 officers. It will also be used to pay a portion of the fire services contract. And then it will be used to pay the police department. Historically, it funds 35% of every PD personnel that's sworn and unsworn. And then it also pays a portion of the dispatch services agreement that the city has with the city of Murrieta for dispatch services. In this upcoming year, the CIP program is recommended to receive $4.9 million of quality of life funds. In 22-23, when we brought the budget last year, there was no recommendations initially. It all went towards the operating side. So this year, it's kind of balancing back around. We did have an appropriation around October, appropriating at that point in time excess fund balance from quality of life towards fire station number 5. But in this budget iteration, again, we're bringing back CIP in the 23-24 budget. For the second year, 24-25, the projected revenues are 21.58. The fund balance, assuming it's all used and approved for 23-24, would be used. And so it is recommended that the revenue that is received in 24-24 be distributed again for 3 officers in code enforcement, for fire services, for personnel in the same ratio of 35% for all PD personnel, and then the rest for dispatch services, and then about just under $400,000 for the CIP program. Which specific projects are being recommended for the quality of life are listed here. We will have a total summary of all the CIP projects that were presented at the latest workshop, but these are the ones that are specific to quality of life, and that's where you see the 4.9 as well as the 396,000 for the following year. A lot of numbers here, but this is how it looks like when we're presenting 2 years of, here's your actuals for 21-22, 22-23 adjusted budget, and then you'll see the 23-24 proposed and the 24-25. That's revenues at the top, expenditures at the bottom for quality of life. And in summary, to the first, one of the initial slides we showed, here the following slides will summarize general fund and quality of life in total, bringing us back to that 97 million and then that 94 for 24-25. Do apologize on the size of the font of this, it's just hard to fit them all in, but this is the fund side broken down by our principal revenues on general fund and quality of life. The use of transfers in, and again, there are transfers in coming in from recurring transfers related to SLESF, which is revenue that is received directly to fund law enforcement operations, so it offsets some of PD's costs. And then we also receive are transferring about 113,000 from the various bonded CFDs for administrative costs. These are recurring transfers that we expect to receive year over year. And the larger component of the 23-24 transfer relates to the $600,000, again referenced from the Commerce Point developer agreement to be used for the EDCSG specific plan. The use of fund balance of 5.274, that's principally mainly quality of life, but there is some from general fund is used for priority CIP projects. We just provided the listing of the DD ones with relation to what general fund CIP project is being funded. That is Bradley Bridge for just over $1 million. So the operating budget for 23-24 is $90.7 million. That is removing the CIP and just presenting capital outlays, personnel, one-time studies, everything but CIP. And we have itemized going forward CEQA apart from planning, so it can stand independently from it. And so you'll see in another slide how planning's budget shifts that way. In the following year, the operating budget would stand at $94.2 million. That includes capital outlays. So in both of these, you will see the vehicle replacements for the police costs. So those are wrapped in here. What's not in here is the construction, the infrastructure. Here is the expenditure side of broken down by major departments of general fund and quality of life. Again, you'll see CEQA as a new one. We have community development planning and community development building and safety, and that is because the two will be function under community development, so we're just distinguishing between the two divisions on there. The decrease in planning, again, percentage from 23-24 to 22-23 really relates to the separation of CEQA itemized out, so it can be more easily tracked and seen, and in that way too, in budget representation and in any summary, it's easy to see the revenues coming in for CEQA and the expenditures as it functions really as a pass-through. The bottom is the quality of life in orange, you'll see, and then that is where we result in the 97.035221 proposed budget for 23-24. That does capture capital projects. And then for 24-25, it is $94.6 million. Capital improvement program. So 2 workshops were held throughout April for this. And so what is being proposed going forward is 21.133, 101,032 projects for 23-24, and then for 24-25, it's 21 projects at just over $12 million. Some minor adjustments since the last workshop that you held were, there was a request in 23-24 for $75,000 for AMR surveillance project. That is actually already funded in the current year in 22-23. It would be carried over into the next year, so an additional appropriation is not needed. It will be carried over as part of the carryover. So the number that you're seeing tonight or today in the 23-24 is less than $75,000. The other 2 minor changes are relating to the rekeying project facilities. The funding source for that is proposed to use facilities fund balance, not DIF, as the facilities fund has the ability to capture that. And then the cost of the ERP implementation project is being shifted funding from general fund and proposing to use Fund 524 DIF, which is how the majority of the existing contract and purchase order is currently being funded, and alleviating general fund from there.
Margarita, I do have a question from Councilmember Estrada.
Yes.
Well, I'm coming in the 9th inning here with the CIP, and I would like to see what the rest of the council thinks about it. IT, can you show the photos, please? It's in regards to a city-owned trail on Getz Road, and this is along Getz Road and the Canyon Heights community. The wood fencing here has deteriorated. This is an older photos, shall I say, from residents. And now when you drive by, there's a bunch of gaps. These have been cleared out. I've talked to our staff about this, and I've been informed there's been vandalism, sometimes cars go crashing into it, just the aging of it. Now, I'd like to see if we can put it on the CIP list, get it replaced, or if it would be more prudent to just remove it altogether, because if people are going to be intentionally vandalizing it and it continues to become a liability to the city, I don't want to pour more money into a project that keeps getting beaten up. So, Mr. Howell, do you have a comment?
I was just here if you have any questions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'll let you discuss what you were going to do.
Oh, I thought you had some input.
Some other input on that for you guys if you have some questions for it.
Okay. Deputy City Manager Nix, what would be the estimate to replace the whole fence?
Yes, Councilmember Estrada, just for some context, this goes along Getz Road. It's about 4,000 linear feet. And Councilmember Estrada is right. This wood fence post isn't our current standard. We use more of a kind of a vinyl fence that you see more around the Audie Murphy area. So we've done our best to replace it with the parts that we've had, but it's really hard and difficult to get this type of fencing material now because not a lot of people make this kind of fence. And it's about 15 years old. And so all those issues that he's brought up as far as vandalism, car accidents is totally true. Bryce and his team do their best to keep it maintained, but if we were going to replace all 4,000 linear feet of the fence with that vinyl type, which is our new standard, it'd be somewhere around $250,000. So if the council would like to add this to the CIP list, we can add it possibly as an unfunded project and look at some funding in the future.
Is this the appropriate time to discuss adding new CIP projects?
We are going over this CIP item now. It'd be really at the council's purview if you wanted to discuss adding an additional item at this time.
Council members, what are your thoughts?
I'm not familiar particularly with this exact fence, but I do know that we are switching out from wood to vinyl, and, we're big advocates of the city should look nicer and people take pride in it, so that does seem to make sense. $250,000 is a little bit, to use the mayor's phrase, a bit of a sticker shock to build a fence. What's the cost of just having no fence there? Like, to remove it?
We can get some labor estimates, or our team could do it over time as part of our regular maintenance.
I don't know, what's the preference of the community having a white vinyl fence there? Like Laladera Park is, I think, the newest one that was installed, so that would probably be similar to what would be installed there versus not having a fence lining that. What's the community preference there that you've been hearing?
Well, people want it addressed. They want a solution. I mean, I drive down Getz Road all the time, and there's a bunch of gaps. I mean, it looks incomplete. It looks, it's not maintained.
Well, the reason I'm asking you is because without a CIP project, our team could just take the fence out.
Well, I'm okay with that too. I think that would be prudent and, responsible if it's going to continue to be vandalized and cars are going to, I don't think cars crash into it that often, but, $250,000 is a lot of money, and I'm also interested in saving the city money, but it's a little bit of an eyesore.
Is there a public safety necessity to have a fence there, or is it mainly aesthetic?
There is some safety element as far as keeping that separation, but we have sidewalks all over the city where there isn't a fence separation between the sidewalk and the road, so it'd be that kind of condition.
And it looks like there's planters in between the trail and the actual curb, so there's a buffer there.
That's correct, Councilmember Estrada. There is that natural landscape buffer.
I say take it out.
We've had a couple of CIP meetings and workshops, and I know that all over the city, because I can say right now on Plomo Valley Wash, there's been vinyl fencing that's been broken since I did the homeless count 2 years ago that still isn't fixed, and that's used a lot. Maybe what we can do is look at this for future CIP project, but ask maybe park maintenance to take a look just all over the city and see where these type of things are needed and look at it at the next CIP. I hate to do that right now on the dais.
Mr. Nix, when the project Canyon Heights was approved, are they part of an LMD or anything else that has financing generated?
Yes, there is a very small LMD there for that area, but it doesn't have the amount of funding needed to replace all the fence all at once. Oh, yeah.
Well, I think this is it's the time to advocate for projects during the CIP workshops and right now during the budget workshops. If there is a particular fence line any council member ever wanted to bring up, these are the moments before we adopt the budget to bring it up. And so right now I'm using this opportunity to bring it up. I'd like to see a solution to it.
If I may, we could phase that in since there is some fund balance that's in there. We could phase this in over the years and remove the fencing that's there and work our way and phase it in different sections to be able to get that 4,000 lineal feet fencing up there. So there is those options that we can do. But it's just the cost is, there's not that much in that zone 37. There's not that much in reserves to be able to replace the entire fence.
Right, so would it be the taste of the council to remove it altogether and save money?
Kind of leaning that way. Mr. Villa, did you want to share?
So I was thinking that if there was desire of the council to add it to the CIP, we can add it to the CIP, it's not a critical, it's not for safety, I think it's more for aesthetics. We put a category 4, and then over the next couple of years, we try to look for budget funding or trail grants to be able to replace it. And then if we can't get to that point where we can get extra dollars, then we just make a decision to remove it at that point.
Well, that's my thinking is we have a CIP budget and we have priority 1, 2, and 3 projects that need to be funded and that are priority, but maybe if we can add it as a 4 and then take that recommendation, I don't see a
What
problem
we
with
could do
that.
in the meantime, since there is the fencing on both sides, we could remove that inner fence, take some of those panels so it's a complete between the sidewalk and the trail. So that outer fence is complete, and we'll just remove that whole inner fence to be able to use those, the material from that to be able to do that for now.
That sounds great.
Yeah, that sounds good. It's definitely a category 4. We definitely have much more important things to do, but there's a lot of gaps all along Getz Road. Okay.
If there's council consensus on that, we'll add it as an unfunded CIP item to make sure we don't lose sight of this project, and we'll move forward with Mr.
I'm in
Allen's
favor of
suggestion.
that.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, so following this input, we will have 33 projects in 23-24. The funding won't change for now, but you'll see one more additional coming up in Parks, Trails, and Recreation.
Hey, just real quick, for future sight, the pavement management program line item here, are we going to be getting a separate breakout of the proposed projects of that? Is that what
Yes.
this is? Because I was looking in here, I didn't see it. So.
Yes. And so we'll start with the category. So we had the summary and then transportation. Here's the breakdown of your transportation projects. And then in the subsequent slides, we'll see the payment management one too. And so you can see we have number of transportation. We have several traffic signals. And here's your payment management one and street improvements listed, funded across the 2 years. And if there's any specific questions on any particular project, our CIP staff is available. These are the projects you have seen in the 2 workshops so far.
If I can just ask, yeah. So I see local roads AC resurfacing program. Is there a sub chart of the local roads that are part of that program or projected to be, or how are we making that determination?
Councilmember Carwin, or Mayor Pro Tem Carwin, sorry. We did, during the workshops, we provided exhibits which broke down the proposed roads that would be within those, the slurry sill program and the local roads AC resurfacing program. We could get you another copy of that if you would like.
Yeah, please. Just I don't want to belabor time. If somebody could
Yeah.
just send me that chart again, I appreciate it. Thanks.
And here are the drainage, public facility, parks, trails, and recreation projects, and IT-related projects. So based, again, on the input today, we will be adding one to the parks, trails, and recreation, just listed to establish the project itself, and leave the funding as unfunded for now. And that brings the total to the 21.13 for 23-24, and then 12.352 for 24-25. So the next slide summarizes citywide all funds across, including general fund, but not limited to general fund and quality of life. And these are important because they provide funding for a lot of our CIP program, but also other crucial services throughout the city. So in a big snapshot and in a pie chart, the 23-24 total would be $135 million, broken up into $97 million from general fund and quality of life, and those are sub-broken down there. The other $38 million would be coming from all other special revenues. That's the internal service funds, CFDs, gas tax, DIF, a number of other funding sources. That connects to the CIP program in that the 21.13, those 32 projects are represented with 6.2 from general fund and quality of life, and the other 14 million come from other funding sources, DIF, Measure A, TUMF, a number of others, and that's how we get to the 21.13. It reflects a total personnel of 329.40. That in the public safety side is 120, and that's sworn and professional, and the cadets program if it is approved on June 7th. For 24-25, the number becomes 130 million, and that's because, as you saw, the CIP program is pretty aggressive in 23-24. It's proposed at 21, and then in 24-25, it's around 12 million. So some of those funding sources, the use of them isn't as needed for what's being proposed for 23-24. In total, the 130 million is represented with the 94.6 million of general fund, broken down to 67 million in general fund directly, and then quality of life. Then 36 million comes from all other funds, totaling 130 million, and the CIP program of 12.3 or 21 projects is funded with 446,000 from general fund and quality of life, and then 11.9 million from all other funds. The workforce for 24-25 is still left at the 329.40 with 120 public safety, sworn, and professional, plus the cadet program. And some of our kind of areas of kind of special revenues that we'd like to highlight in our budget process and just surface it more for transparency purposes and just in the interest of for the public to be aware of how vital these special revenues are and how they are used, and that's in the area of our special districts. That's our a lot of acronyms, LLMDs, CFDs, and CSAs. The city has a number of these. Some of them predate the city's incorporation and were passed on to us or inherited to us from the county, and some of them we have formed ourselves. So LLMD stands for Lighting and Landscape Maintenance District. There are 44 independent funds for which the city collects dedicated special assessments via the property tax that pay a number of eligible services across the zones. That includes things like right-of-way and landscape maintenance, traffic signal maintenance, fossil filter maintenance, and streetlights. We also have 6 county service areas, or CSAs, that are represented by 6 separate funds, and the eligible services for these are generally streetlights for the majority of them, except for CSA 145, which is also eligible to fund things like park maintenance, right-of-way maintenance, streetlights, and recreation services. We also have CSA 86, which specifically funds road maintenance, streetlights, and law enforcement services. So we use this funding to pay for one dedicated officer as part of that. And then we have 60 community facilities districts and growing. So our LLMDs are inherited from the county. Those 44 will stay at the 44. They provide funding for us for those dedicated areas. Same thing with the CSAs. We don't expand them or add to them. But the CFDs are a mechanism that the city has had in place starting with our first CFD, which was CFD 2012-1, the Audie Murphy Ranch CFD. And then shortly thereafter, we had Hidden Hills. And from there on out, it has provided the city a mechanism to collect dedicated revenue that provides a number of, again, direct funding for regular maintenance. And oftentimes, it will also provide funding for CIP projects. Audie Murphy, for example, is the funding source that's being recommended for a couple CIP projects in the upcoming 2 years, but it has also provided funding in the past. The CFDs have a little bit more flexibility other than CSA 145 in the sense that they capture everything the LLMD does and the CSA except for the recreation side, but they also fund things like street sweeping and street maintenance, channel maintenance and drainage, and trail maintenance. And in the area of street sweeping in particular, as you'll recall, given that in the state there was a DIR determination not too long ago, street sweeping services, as far as what our obligation is now done in-house because the cost of contracting it out would have the city paying a really high hourly rate for contract services. So the city Public Works Department has assumed street sweeping operations, and the special districts that get the street sweeping service are able to directly contribute for their street sweeping service. In the upcoming 23-24 year, there is the intent to buy a new street sweeping vehicle. We did buy a used one. Council approved that later in the year, but the intent is to buy a new one, and we will be leveraging the funds from the special districts that provide street sweeping to cover the cost of that capital outlay. So as they continue to add, it is a lot of funds and a lot of kind of coordination to get those together, but they are well worth it because they again augment and provide crucial funding to our services and capital outlay purchases. The services themselves are managed between our Community Services Department and our Public Works Department because the responsibilities of right-of-way and park maintenance and street maintenance are shared across the departments depending on what we are asking. And at the request of council, this is a kind of an updated summary of what we would be looking to update and expand the communication and information that we provide in our reporting of our CSAs in our budget book, just to provide that additional clarity of things of like, what is the fund balance? It is important to note that revenues and expenditures are separately tracked for each special district, so its fund balance stays by itself, and so the use of it stays within the boundaries of it. And so as we use fund balance, it is typically used and managed with the intent to use for one-time larger capital expenditures or CIP projects. So for instance, here is CSA 86 providing actuals in the last few years, and the addition and enhancements from what was previously there is providing at the bottom a clear indicating of the specific fund balance of that CSA, what the estimated fund balance would be at the end of the year, and if it's used, what specifically it's being used for, so that any person that may be interested in looking at it has a good understanding of why and what the intent was in that. So for CSA 86 in the current year, 23-24, there was the intentional use of fund balance in the amount of $100,000, and that went towards CIP 2308, the Quail Valley grid streetlights. And then in 24-25, there is the recommendation of using $900,000 towards CIP 2302. That's the Getz Road Vista Way traffic signal project. It is part of the funding that you guys saw in the workshop, but in our reporting and summary, it's just a way to bring it back all together and put it together, and you can kind of see the running balance from year to year. It's our intent to do that with our special districts, just to facilitate the way that somebody can see information, and obviously we're welcome and open to any additional input that the public or council may have to continue to just provide information in a clear, easier way and consolidated way for the public to find. Yes.
Thank you to staff for making this much easier to read. I'm comparing it with last year's budget documentation, and the last two lines where you talk about beginning fund balance and then the estimated fund balance at June 30th brings a lot more transparency for Quail Valley residents, because no one knew how much was actually in it. And now we can see we have the fund balance to begin and the fund balance to end. I see personnel. Yeah, is that law enforcement?
Yes, that covers one full officer and his benefits, and it also covers a small portion of street maintenance, as they provide street maintenance repairs, but not your full equivalent is the one officer.
Okay, and this doesn't go to a specific officer dedicated to patrolling Quail Valley. It goes to the overall department?
I believe so, but we can ask.
Okay, can somebody help clarify that,
yes,
please?
So our POP team, our problem-oriented policing team, is currently comprised of 2 POP officers, 1 homeless liaison officer, a CBAT officer, our mental health clinician officer, and one of those officers does dedicate a lot of time to Quail Valley issues. We come up with a lot of POP projects that are out there, attending the Quail Valley meeting, addressing concerns for the community. So amongst that group, they do focus a lot of their time out there in the community.
Okay, thanks, because this tax is paid specifically when, or Quail Valley residents pay into it expecting law enforcement. And I just want the public to have a little bit more clarification. They're paying for this service, and are they getting extra attention, and that helps clarify a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Yeah.
And summary with relation to the budget proposals for the 2 years and American Rescue. What's being proposed, there's only just one recommendation at this time, and that is for the use of $531,000 towards the CIP 20-13 Paloma Wash Pedestrian Bridge as part of the 23-24 CIP program. And so as we round out the presentation, we just want to talk about the importance of long-range financial planning and how that relates. And we've taken the 2 years and we've built them out, and we started the budget kind of engagement in the first workshop, giving you guys a preview of the 10-year forecast model. And so we've taken the time to put that now into the 10-year model and build it together. So I'd like to invite Mr. Dominic Tartaglia, our principal accountant, who kind of give you guys the introduction to the 10-year model so he can outline what graphically it looks like in our 10-year model and what the outlook looks in that way.
Thank you. Good evening, Council, Honorable Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, Council members. My son introduced me to Robert's Rules of Order, so I now know how to properly address you. Before I go into the 10-year model, I did want to just recognize, as you've seen, if you're still with us here, this is a lot of information, a lot of budgeting went into this, a lot of numbers, a lot of people. So I just wanted to recognize, of the 30 or so staff you see here, I believe every single one of them was involved in this budget process. And we also have a new financial analyst in the finance department. Her name is Lori Lockwood, and she is actually dealing specifically just with special districts. So there are 110 of those, as you saw in the previous slide. And so she will be helping a lot in maintaining those and reviewing the financials for them. So we're very thankful for all of the staff and all they have done in getting this budget together, especially as we transition to a 2-year. It was a large project to go into, but thankfully we also used some new tools this year. Among them was the 10-year, and as well as the 10-year, we also, we also tied the economic numbers that we're using. We tried to tie them more directly to the line items to see how they would individually be impacted in a changing economy. And as well as that, we did more ratio analysis this year in terms of looking at how numbers relate to each other. And by doing ratio analysis, we're able to see if anything stuck out, and we could analyze that more deeply and look for odd things or errors, and in that way we're able to really strengthen our numbers and have a lot of confidence in them. And so that brings us to our 10-year model. So we put into the 10-year model the exact numbers you have seen for the next 2 years, these proposed numbers. So if these numbers going forward were accepted, this is what the 10-year model gives us. So with the first graph, you can see that there is that negative number in the next year and that red bar, and that is the proposed use of fund balance as discussed. If we take out CIP, the graph on the right shows just the operating budget, and you can see that the blue bars are a good thing. That shows revenues over expenditures for the year. And so you can see every year from next year until 10 years out, we would have positive growth of revenues growing over revenues during that time. So the model and all this economic analysis and all of this large data crunching, it really gives us a lot of confidence. So I know Ms. Cornejo is using the example of this guidance of going on a trail or over a mountain, and that was kind of the theme we were going with. And really, like in the past, we've had our map, we knew we were going, but now we are using more advanced things like topography, as an example, to just drill down even deeper on these numbers and have much more confidence in them. And so just to give you an idea of what this looks like with the actual numbers in the model, it's tiny, but this is what it actually looks like. So you can see the first year at the top, which is just after that gray column, is FY 23-24 proposed that we've presented here for council's consideration, and that is exactly tied to the numbers that we are proposing, and then the next year is also tied directly to the numbers being proposed, and then from years 3 on out to year 10, the model takes over and uses that economic analysis and the large data crunching to give us these numbers. As you can see, the green numbers, revenue at the top, are growing faster than the orange numbers at the bottom, which are the expenditures, and that is a good thing for our city. So overall, we just hope that this model and the 2-year planning going into the 10-year planning with all these new tools at our disposal, we're just really hoping that this can give council and the residents of the city just greater confidence in our budget and our process and our financial management of the city therein. I'll pass it back to Ms. Cornett.
Yeah, and Dominic, I do have a question from Councilmember Estrada. I don't know if it's direct.
Yes, Dominic, there's a lot of numbers going on, but could you let the public know if we have any surpluses budgeted for this year or for next year?
So as presented in the budget that is proposed, we would be doing a balanced budget where we did have slight reserves or revenue left over, and that is being proposed for the use of these important CIP projects.
Okay, so every dollar that we have is allocated. There's nothing left over that's discretionary?
With relation to excess beyond our reserve requirements, yes, we are making a recommendation to use the quality of life fund balance, which is the majority of it, and then everything else is set aside in our reserve requirement to accommodate to that. So at this time, it is this related to general fund and quality of life.
Do you have a specific number?
For quality of life?
For
and
general fund?
For general fund, we are recommending to use the 1.2 million towards the Bradley Bridge project. I think it was 1,232, something like that, on the project itself. So that's what's being, that's the excess above our reserve requirement.
Okay, and for quality of life?
It's $4.041 million that's being used for those projects that were listed in 23-24.
Okay, thank you.
Like that you said that it's in excess of
right.
our reserve fund policy of 35%. We're keeping that, maintaining that. We're just using whatever goes beyond that.
Right, and keeping in mind that even our reserve requirement in the proposed budget, because it's a percentage base, needs to be adjusted so the amount goes up. And we've gone through that exercise first to make sure we are in compliance with that reserve requirement if we were to move forward with the proposed budget as it's being presented for consideration. And same thing with 24-25, want to make sure we're in compliance with that. So we always look at excess after that way. So it's 5 o'clock. So we thank you. That is the last part of the presentation today. What follows after this would be that on June 7th, we will present a final budget for council adoption. That said, the intent of this workshop today is to collect any input or feedback that the council or the public may have to wrap that in. And so when we come back on June 7th, we have a final budget with the book and the goals and objectives and everything outlined. To what Dominic did state, we do want to take the time to really thank our departments that worked and climbed this mountains with us to get through this year. I think when we first started in January, we talked a lot about like 2 years sounds really scary because we're like, it's something since our incorporation we haven't done. We have some staff that has been fortunate enough to have the experience of dealing with 2-year budget cycles, but for the organization, it was new altogether. But we also knew we have other competing things that we're navigating, like our new ERP, and that this would also benefit us once we got through this hurdle in clearing up some space. So it's very nice to stand here today and have what 2 years looks like, and it is an understatement to say that it really came from the collaboration and the efforts of the various departments that have been here. We have various finance staff that's here. We don't have all 20 members here, but it is just a collaborative process, and that is the intent of budget, to always be that way, that as we go from January all the way through the June adoption, and while not every request can always be accommodated and approved, that there's a mutual respect and understanding for the time and effort that's put together by the staff to accomplish this. That said, if there are any additional questions the council may have or input or feedback, we're open to that, and staff is available to answer any questions if there's department-specific questions.
All right, thank you, Margarita. And I'll just ask real quick, Madam Clerk, do we have any requests to speak from the public on this?
No requests.
Okay, so council members, we're free to go beyond just questions and provide any input at this point. If you have any comments or suggestions, recommendations, Councilman Estrada is first in the queue, and then Councilmember Dinas.
Ms. Cornejo, you mentioned the surpluses for this year. What are the surpluses for general fund next year and for quality of life?
Okay, so that's a good question. We will be reviewing that during our mid-cycle and mid-year review as we start to realize we'll close out this year. And so we'll see if there's expenditure savings and revenues, like for example, last year came in significantly higher. Now, quality of life and sales tax in particularly come in arrears. There's always like a 2-month lag because it comes from the state all the way down. So we'll get a really clear picture of what our final revenues look like. We also oftentimes realize savings in things like our fire contract, but again, because that's a state with county to city kind of agreement, there's multiple entities that go through. So our billing really doesn't close out really until about August, if we're lucky, in the year. So we would be looking to revisit what any surplus and excess look like tentatively around the January kind of time frame, the 6-month mark into the fiscal year, where we would have our books closed and an idea of kind of how we closed out the year.
Okay, and at this time, staff hasn't made any recommendations to allocate potential surpluses at mid-year?
Not at this time. We are budgeting conservatively to say that what we budget, we will spend in 23-24, and so 24-25 right now stands balanced based on the revenues that are going to come in and the proposed expenditures.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Dinas.
Thank you. In your presentation, you mentioned the state budget, went from $100 million surplus to $22 billion deficit. Any impact to the city on that?
So to the city, in some ways, there was one revenue that for a while they withheld from us, which was VLF. But for the most part, our top 5 revenues, other than that, are local, like our quality of life is completely ours alone. Our sales tax rate is established already. So we aren't as reliant on direct state funding as like a school district would be. So that wouldn't impact any. Now, where we could see it is if they had like funding opportunity for grant projects where there wouldn't be as many. Although oftentimes a lot of the grants that we are competing for are federal pass-throughs to the state. So we'll navigate that one, but not directly to our 5 principal revenues.
I think just want to ensure our residents that even though we see California having some issues, that is not
going to impact.
Not have a big impact on us as it could be. The second all then is you mentioned in one of your slides you're going to continue to pay the unfunded pension liability. Do you foresee that increasing very much?
So that we have in our budget built it to increase because there is an element of it that is impacted by the workforce size itself. But also it is also impacted by whatever the economy is doing. So last year, for example, investments overall weren't as good, so what was passed back to all the agencies that pay into was a larger bill than normal. So it's a balancing. How we forecast it is to increase year over year, just because our workforce is, and because historically we've seen it go that way.
And so that's built into your 10-year forecast then as well?
As it's growing steadily. Now, we don't expect it to like double. And that is one good thing and to point out too. The 10-year model is also based on the premise that our expenditures are growing steadily and not spiking. And I think that really goes a lot in alignment in consideration, even when it comes to personnel additions, that we factor that in. If you start making any expenditure significantly spike, then that can drastically change that graph from all that nice blue to some reds. What we're seeing it is in a base kind of in our trends and factoring that in. We'll adjust it year to year and see how that plays out. But for 23-24, we are proposing in both that it would increase from the current year.
Thank you. A lot of charts. I think I understood. I think I got it right here on the quality of life is fully funding our fire department services.
No, the fire services is around 18 million, I believe, 19 million for 23-24, and 24-25 is just over 20 million.
Okay.
So we're doing about 13, I think, in both years.
It's funding about 60% of
Yes.
the fire department.
I was trying to
Get the total.
get the gist of that. Thank you. On the 10-year forecast, you show the annual operating surplus over deficit and how it grows. Does that interpreted then, you see the blue line increasing constantly, that mean we're having a greater surplus? I mean, because it just shows us the surplus over revenue over expenditures, but it doesn't show the revenue and expenditure, so we don't know that how much additional revenue we have over expenses that we anticipate. So I'm just trying to interpret what the blue bars mean.
Like
you see, you have a surplus. Are you saying that at the out year of 2033, we're going to have over $10 million surplus?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
That those are just revenues over expenses is what the blue bar represents. So any blue that you see is excess revenue over expenditures, and that is the way the model works. And it is showing that because of our rapid growth and our healthy history here in Menifee, that we are projecting that revenues are going to grow faster than expenditures are. And so if we maintained our course right now, in 10 years we could have $10 million in excess revenue.
And I'd like to add to that that the model is a great model, but a point in time. So that's not taking into consideration future employee growth. So that's as we are now, incorporating what future cost increases will be for our staffing levels now and those increases in expenditures, but that's not including additional positions added.
I just want to make sure that we don't think, ooh, we got how much more money to spend here. So, my final, it's not more of a question, it's a comment on how, with the 2-year budget cycle now, it's new, it will be our first time we do it. Probably a good time given the ERP project we're getting ready to kick off. My one concern is that, as it was alluded to, that we had our mid-year budget report in April, which gives me a great cause for concern. With a 2-year budget cycle, will we be able to get to where we could have the mid-year budget review in December? And the reason I ask that is because if we find out there's an issue in our budget in April, it gives us only 2 months to the end of the fiscal year to fix it, as opposed to if there's some serious adjustments to our budget, and we find out in December, it's a lot less painful to fix that, any shortfall.
So we do start looking at the mid-year in December, but we do need to wait for the first 6 months to close. And we can't close December until really the latter part of January by the time we see all of the revenues. And it is a process to close the books for each month. So the soonest we could bring it back realistically, absolute soonest would be January, but really prudent would be February to have a clear picture of a full 6 months so we can accurately project what the second 6 months of the fiscal year will look like. We will be more timely going forward, and we are going to work towards quarterly updates. We likely can't get to the quarterly updates to council until we get into the new system because of our system limitations in the current financial accounting system. We will be working towards that, but we will absolutely be more timely coming next year with our mid-year cycle. Or I'm sorry, our mid-year budget.
Because it's important that we have that information as early as possible, I believe, because it can cause a lot of problems. I've seen it in the past. I want to make sure that we get our information early, we can react early, and we keep our budget sustainable.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I did want to add, unfortunately, this year was a unique year in that we were doing a full reorganization of our finance department. We did, as you approved in that mid-year budget, previously, or I'm sorry, the previous budget, that we added the accountant series. So we added Dominic's position, the principal accountant, a senior accountant, an accountant, and 2 other accountants. We were reorganizing and shifting a lot of the processes in finance. So there were some internal changes going on at the same time that we were looking to review the mid-year budget. So we were unfortunately behind the ball this year, but that will not occur next year.
Thank you. That's all I have. Thank you.
Council members, any other comments? Councilman Estrada?
Mrs. Cornejo and Mrs. Clayton, I have an appetite to address our $21.9 million we have in the debt service fund. I was looking at our budget from last year, and we paid $570,000 in interest. And nobody likes paying interest. I would appreciate it if, when we have the surpluses or projections for 24-25, if we applied that down payment towards our debt service fund, what type of ripple effect would that have? How would we eliminate the compounding interest? I noticed that by the year 2045, we would have paid about $11.7 million in interest, and 11.7 could pay for a lot of projects. So I would be interested in seeing how paying down that debt service fund would free up some money for the city.
We do have some limitations, and I'll let Ms. Cornejo expand. But one major point that I would like to make is that the debt service that we currently have, we are able to pay with restricted funding. So the surplus funding that we typically have is in our general fund, or what we've allocated, for instance, this year from Measure DD, Quality of Life, has gone to capital projects.
Yeah, I would be interested in the general fund surplus.
Right. And while what we are able to pay our debt service with currently is specific to gas tax and some of our LLMDs because it's specific to street lighting, so we have the opportunity to free up our general fund that can be used for anything by using our restricted funds to pay for the debt service. But beyond that, we also have limitations in prepayment penalties and the soonest that we can pay. So I'll let Margarita explain a little more detail on that.
Yeah, and the timing on it too will give us, I guess, time to do that anyway, because the 2 debts that we do currently have, one is for the streetlight retrofit project, which related to acquiring the lights, and it was about just over 6,000 lights that were purchased across the city, retrofitted to LEDs. City issued about $6.5 million, and it's being repaid back with really various special districts, like Rochelle said, CSAs and LLMDs, and some gas tax. That one in particular has a prepayment. It does have a prepayment premium if you do, but it's eligible for prepayment beginning 2026. So you'd have to wait for that. And then the second debt that we have is the TRIP debt, which relates to the financing that was done back in 2012 for the Newport project. And that one is a larger amount. That one is pledged to be paid back currently with Measure A and or gas tax, both of which are funds that are meant to be directed to road projects. So it kind of puts it back in that vein. It helped finance a project in advance. The prepayment kind of clause for that particular one, because it's a larger amount, is 2031. But we can keep that in radar, especially with the streetlight one in 2026, to see kind of what the numbers go in that way.
Thank you. I think it would be beneficial to look at saving money on interest. Okay.
Yeah, if we can. Mr. Viet.
What I was going to mention is it's a good idea to save on interest, but it's also wise to look at how we manage debt, right? I wouldn't recommend that we use general fund money to pay for that debt because we are capturing the debt service from monies that are not general fund. They're actually restricted funds from gas taxes. Which is not really general fund money, not our money. It's money that's generated by that 1 cent. So it is it is going to be a policy decision, a prerogative of the council if you wish to do that, but I would recommend that we look at that, study that, because we could utilize general fund money to pay for other things while we still capture monies that are not directly tied to general fund to pay for debt service on the other two. That's all I want to say.
All right, any other comments, council members? I think we're there. I want to thank everybody and the team, and Margarita did a great job presenting today. Thank you so much. So with that, we are going to adjourn. It is 5:27, and thanks, everybody. We will be back shortly after our closed session. Don't get too far away.